So I want to talk about the history, which is rather different than what people generally understand, both people outside the movement and inside the movement. I want to talk about the current organization of the movement, which is, again, very different from what most people perceive. And then I want to make an effort at an explanation, at the psychology, let's say, of this phenomenon, which is very peculiar and has very peculiar features that deserve to be highlighted. But the only way that we can get to that point, I think, is to start by looking at the history. So it's become kind of commonplace to attribute the BDS movement to its origins to the 2001 United Nations World Conference on Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance in Durban, South Africa. This actually is completely wrong. The origins of the BDS movement, its history, go back over a century, in effect. And I'll just hit some of the major points. We have to talk, for one thing, about the 1945 Arab League boycott of Jews in Palestine and beyond. Before that, even, Arab boycotts of Jews in mandatory Palestine began, I believe, in 1922. But the Arab League was founded in 1945 with its primary mission being anti-Zionism. This was one of the major issues, perhaps the only major issue, that Arab countries, newly formed for the most part Arab countries, could agree on. And the Arab League boycott, the boycott office, was created to prevent Western countries from dealing with Israel and doing business in the Arab states. And it still exists today. Another aspect that people don't really talk about, and they should, is that already in the 1930s and the 1940s, the American Arab community began to be united around the issue of anti-Zionism. And there were a number of organizations and publications that were created at this time. The Arab National League, the Conference of Americans of Arabic-Speaking Origin. One of the most interesting organizations was called the Institute of Arab American Affairs, which was created in 1945. And this particular organization is very important because it was actually founded by Arab Americans, most of whom had been educated by Quakers. It was also supported by the children of Christian missionaries who were in the process of leaving the Middle East, and by representatives of Aramco, the American Arabian oil company, and the CIA. There were a number of serving CIA officers, not least of whom was Kermit Roosevelt, who were leading anti-Zionist voices in the 1940s. Move forward a little bit, the Association of Arab American University Graduates, created in 1967. This was yet another iteration of the anti-Zionist organizations that were being created on the ground in the United States, but this time with a particular focus in universities. Now, I'll preface my remarks a little bit that, well, let me skip to the most important part, and that's the New Left of the 1960s. And the New Left then consisted of a variety of organizations, Jewish and non-Jewish. What was the mentality? What was the rationale of the New Left generally? It was a very broad topic, obviously. But to summarize, the personal was the political. There was no separation between politics and personal belief, personal behavior. Politics became an arena for people to play out their own personal psychodramas, their own psychological rejection of the status quo in particular. We're all familiar with the term tenured radicals. This is the period when this phenomenon came about of academics who saw no difference between their politics and their pedagogy, entering the academy and creating generations of graduate students who've gone on until today. There are intellectual trends that come out of the 1960s. Postmodernism, post-colonialism, the idea that only natives or indigenous people can have the legitimacy, have the standing to talk or teach about certain kinds of historical or cultural phenomenon, the idea that nobody has a monopoly on a viewpoint, that all viewpoints are relative and therefore equal. The idea of third worldism, that the third world was an oppressed place, oppressed by the West, and that gave non-Western voices a unique moral standing. And it's also the period that we have to note that the politics and the economics of the university began to change. The universities were a phenomenally important locus for politics during that period, opposition to the Vietnam War, and in particular, opposition to the draft, opposition to the United States, opposition to Western, what were called Western values. Previously, throughout the 30s, 40s, into the 1950s, many members of the left, the socialist left, even the parts of the communist left, were favorably predisposed towards Israel and towards Jews. Not all, but many. And this very much began to change in the United States and also, in particular, in the United Kingdom after 1968, also in France and throughout Europe. We also have to make a special note about the Jewish left from the 1960s and afterwards, because a lot of what was called the New Left came out of Jewish sources, you might say. Jewish kids, Jewish intellectuals who very much rejected their backgrounds, their heritages, or what they thought was their parents' legacy, to move very much to the political far left. The Students for Democratic Society, which was created in 1962, I think, there was a very important Jewish component in this organization. And there are a number of Jewish organizations focused specifically on Arab-Israeli issues that emerged in the period after 1967, after the Six-Day War. The Committee on New Alternatives in the Middle East. The Socialist Workers' Party had a big orientation towards this. The Middle East Research and Information Project. Many of these groups had links to not only to the far left, but also to, in the case of Middle East Research Institute, cooperation with the Fatah movement. Socialist Workers' Party was connected to the Communist Party, the Global Communist Party, and so on. A group called Brera from 1973 to 1977 had a rabbinical committee of rabbis who were opposed to Israeli policy and opposed to the way the Israeli government was conducting itself. And there are other organizations in this universe as well, with lots of different names, all of which have disappeared and all of which have been forgotten, except for the fact that there are a number of personal continuities between the New Left and the New Jewish Left of the 1960s and BDS organizations of today. Some of the same people with very much the same kinds of attitudes. I'll name one other organization, the Institute for Policy Studies, which there's no reason why you all should have ever heard of it, except it was, one of the leading figures was Arthur Waskow, who was part of this new Jewish left. And today, the Institute for Policy Studies is one of the most important supporting organizations for the modern BDS movement. Now, the Institute for Policy Studies was also a kind of KGB front organization in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So there's a number of different continuities that go from then until today. And these Jewish organizations, these Jewish groups, one of the things that they did was to create lots of problems for the mainstream Jewish movements, for the conservative and reform movements in particular, precisely in the manner that J Street and Jewish Voice for Peace do today. Opposition to the idea that the Jewish community in America speaks with one voice, opposition to anything that the Israeli, whichever Israeli government does, opposition, and this is really before the settlement phenomenon in the West Bank and Gaza emerged in Israel, in favor of negotiating with the PLO, in favor of maximum withdrawal from the territories, in the beginning of this occupation rhetoric, which is obviously prominent today. So I mentioned the KGB. The KGB is actually one of the most important sources for contemporary anti-Zionism. And this goes back, well, it goes back to the origins of the communist movement in the Soviet Union and tensions that were played out really on the persons of Jewish communists in the Soviet Union. If you were a Jew, and if you had any support or expressed any support for Jewish nationalism, this was a betrayal of the revolution. And this was a theme that went up and down throughout the history of the Soviet Union. But in the 1960s in particular, it became a very prominent theme that was articulated in Poland in 1968, and then as a theme distributed by the KGB to global communist movements, the idea of Zionism as racism. And this culminated 40 years ago tomorrow, with United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3370, which condemned Zionism as racism. And this concept, this rhetoric, was disseminated widely throughout the world through communist front groups and to revolutionary organizations like the African National Congress, which received all of its training in the Soviet Union and in East Germany. Then we have to talk about the other, another thread, which is really quite different, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, which is really one of the foremost organizations pushing BDS organizationally and conceptually. Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928 in Egypt, and there are a number of Saudi organizations which emerged in the 1960s to spread the Saudi worldview, which prominently included opposition to Israel, anti-Zionism, and their own brand of fundamentalism. The Muslim World League in 1962, the World Association of Muslim Youth, founded in 1972, the International Islamic Federation of Student Organizations in 1969, and so on. Muslim Student Association was founded at the University of Illinois in 1962. It was classified as a church by the Internal Revenue Service in 1981 for reasons that aren't really clear. The North American Islamic Trust, created in 1973, it owns something around 80% of all the mosques in North America. Owns them, physically owns the leases. The International Institute of Islamic Thought, the Islamic Society of North America, both founded in 1981, the Islamic Association for Palestine, many different, the Council on American Islamic Relations, founded in 1993. Students for Justice in Palestine is one of these organizations. It grew out of a group called the General Union of Palestinian Students, which was founded in Egypt in 1959, which became a focal point for Palestinian students to kind of fight out their theoretical debates and to take charge of the process of revolutionizing Palestinian campuses around Palestinian students around the world. So there was a branch of the General Union founded in 1973 at San Francisco State, and then refounded in the year 2000 at Berkeley with funding from another Muslim Brotherhood-backed organization, Al-Auda. So here we have another very interesting and very important theme, and that is the BDS movement as a whole and Palestinian politics as a whole is strongly shaped not simply by Palestinians within the West Bank or Gaza, but Palestinians outside in the Arab world, in Western Europe, and increasingly in the United States. That they have, for decades, taken the initiative to try and shift Palestinian politics and the Palestinian movement. And not infrequently, they stand in decided opposition to the ruling Fatah movement. Other antecedents, and I'm almost done with the antecedents. Very important to talk about Britain. Because in Britain, in the 1970s and the 1980s, Palestinian politics became very much a cause célèbre on British campuses. So in the late 1970s and by the early 1980s, working alongside socialist and communist student groups, and there was a cascade that first, I believe it was the University of Salford, the student government decided that they would no longer fund Jewish student societies. And within a couple of weeks, this expanded to over a dozen different universities. Why? Because these organizations were essentially being outlawed because Zionism was racism. And this larger phenomenon of alliances between Palestinian and Muslim students and the far left cascaded very rapidly through British society, through British civil society, let's call it. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the leading BDS organization in Britain, was founded in 1982 by a Communist Party member, Tony Greenstein, former Jewish guy, of course. The Palestine Return Center, which is the most important sort of research organization, was founded in 1986 by a Hamas-affiliated individual. This is the Red-Green Alliance. This is the alliance between communists and socialists and Islamists. Mostly Brotherhood, mostly Sunni Brotherhood related, although in Britain there's lots of different organizations. There are Shiite BDS organizations, there's Sunni BDS organizations, which have student groups, which have relations with labor unions, which have research groups, which are called upon to participate in government anti-radicalization projects, and so on, and so on, and so on. How did it all start? Basically, It all started in a process that's called entryism. It all started with Palestinians and communists working together on campuses, taking over student governments. I mean, that's the sort of the short, boiled down version of it. So let me mention a couple of other random factors. One very important organization that I've done a lot of work on is the American Friends Service Committee, which is really one of the leading supporters of BDS in this country. It has 2 different offices devoted just to this. It worked closely with Jewish Voice for Peace, works closely with Students for Justice in Palestine. One would think that Quakers would have a more pacifist kind of attitude or benign attitude towards Jews, but since 1967 they have been increasingly hostile towards Israel in particular, and they have in that time increasingly adopted a traditional Protestant narrative of supersessionism, that the Jews have lost their covenant with God and they've been replaced by somebody else. And then the American Friends Service Committee has a budget of $156 million a year. It has a network of colleges in Pennsylvania and the Midwest. It has hundreds of meetings, congregations. They don't have churches per se. And it has at least dozens and dozens of schools, all of which are, to a greater or lesser extent, part of the structure of BDS. So my point really is that there are many different foundations that the modern BDS movement is built on. It's not just one. Some of them are Middle Eastern, some of them are Muslim, some of them are indigenous American. And they have come together today to create a very interesting movement, you might say. So how does it work? The modern BDS movement is really begins, we have to say, not with Durban in 2001, but with the creation of Students for Justice in Palestine in 2000, 2001 at Berkeley. The force behind this was Al-Auda, the Palestine Right to Return Committee, which is still an important entity, which was created in 2000 by individuals who were connected with a variety of other organizations. The International Solidarity Movement, the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, and the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel. At Durban in 2001, that's when the precise model was articulated, that Israel was going to be boycotted along the same lines as South Africa had been during the apartheid era. Israel was an apartheid state, intrinsically discriminatory, and that had to be boycotted, particularly by academic and cultural figures, in order for it to change its behavior. And this cascaded rapidly. British academics called for a boycott in 2002, French academics in 2002. The Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel was created in 2004 by a character named Omar Barghouti, who was then a graduate student at Tel Aviv University. And this has become the leading academic boycott group. And there are other national umbrella groups all over Europe. In 2005, there was something called the Palestinian Civil Society Call for BDS, which was supposedly the BDS call endorsed by over 170 Palestinian political parties, organizations, trade unions, and movements. Most of these, when you look at them carefully, are very mysterious groups that nobody's ever heard of. It's not clear whether this is a manifestation of either the PLO ginning up something or actual a kind of fabrication that was freelanced by an individual. It's just not clear. The most important organizations today are the Palestinian BDS National Committee, created in 2007, which consists of 2 or possibly 3 individuals in the West Bank. And I talked to dissident Palestinians, and they've never heard of these guys. They don't know who these guys are, where they come from. This is a very important organization that pushes BDS, particularly in the Arab world, trying to get Arab governments to not do business with companies that have business in Israel. In the U.S., the most important organizations today really are part of the Muslim Brotherhood network. CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, the group American Muslims for Palestine, Muslim student associations, and Students for Justice in Palestine. These are basically interlocking organizations. They share leadership, they share post office boxes, they share offices. And around 2010, there was a unification effort pushed by American Muslims for Palestine. American Muslims for Palestine is the lead organization on this issue, which has very strong connections to Hamas. Today, there are over somewhere around 200 chapters on college campuses, and SJPs and Muslim student organizations work together. And this is the same process of entryism that was documented in British universities, taking over university governments, voting in your friends, and then controlling the budgets. And then who do you give money to? We're not necessarily talking about tremendous amounts of money, but student organizations run on money. And they run on legitimacy that comes from getting money. There's a whole new aspect to this that's developed in the last 3-4 years or so, and that's the lawyering up phase. There was a group called Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, which is now just called Palestine Legal, which was created with the help of the far left Center for Constitutional Rights and the National Lawyers Guild. Basically, the National Lawyers Guild are let's not put too fine a point on it, they're the communist lawyers. It's the Communist Lawyers Association. And they're working together to support BDS on campus wherever there is a perceived threat, and the perceived threat is anybody who speaks ill of them. And they've issued legal guidelines. They offer legal support. They'll go to court for you. They have all of these organizations have a wide range of support materials. They have national conferences where they train students in fundraising and organization and media and outreach, and so on. That's one of the real legs of the modern BDS movement. The other is the far left, and the first element of this is called the U.S. Campaign to End the Occupation, which fundraises under the name Education for Just Peace in the Middle East. So that's what you write the check out to, and this is a coordination body. It's an umbrella organization, and it represents a variety of groups, including Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, Middle East Children's Alliance, International Solidarity Movement, American Friends Service Committee, National Lawyers Guild, Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, International Socialist Organization, the Methodist Church, Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, Muslim Student Associations, and more. It's a 501c3 organization which, through a peculiar quirk of the tax code, also does lobbying on Capitol Hill as a 501h organization. The president of this is Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies. The national advocacy director is formerly of Jewish Voice for Peace. They do grassroots training with Code Pink. They have a vast outreach effort that goes on. They work closely with the American Friends Service Committee. American Friends Service Committee has, as I said, 2 offices and several programs dedicated just to BDS. One of the individuals, leading individuals, is a person called Dalit Baum, former Israeli. She also works for a group called Global Exchange, which was founded by Code Pink creator Medea Benjamin. Medea Benjamin, who used to be called Susie Benjamin, before she rebelled against her parents and became Medea. All of this is supported by an array of foundations and charities. And I'll just throw out some names. They probably won't mean anything to you. The Westpac Foundation of White Plains, New York, right near me. They are the fiscal sponsors of National Students for Justice in Palestine, of Al-Auda, of the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, and they also support Israel Apartheid Week. And they provide in-house support, probably secretarial support. The Cultures of Resistance Network Foundation supports If Americans Knew, the Israel Committee Against House Demolitions, Code Pink, Jewish Voice for Peace, Institute for Policy Studies, and the Westpac Foundation. And so on and so on and so on. It's an interlocking network of far-left foundations, far-left personal donors like Medea Benjamin, like Lynn Handelman, who support all of these groups. I already mentioned the lawyers, and there's an array of Palestinian American lawyers, many of whom actually went to work for the PLO during the 1990s as part of the negotiation group. Some of whom came back and are now involved with BDS. The National Lawyers Guild, Center for Constitutional Rights, the National Muslim Law Students Association. All of these are organizations that are fundamental and deeply involved. Let me talk a little bit about the Jewish far left, or the Jewish left, wherever we want to put some of these groups. Jewish Voice for Peace was founded in 1996 by 3 women from Berkeley. And they work closely with Al-Auda, the Presbyterian Church, USA, International Answer. They're founded by all of these same organizations. They are the ones who are behind the Open Hillel movement, the idea that Hillel foundations must, as a matter of conscience, open their doors to anti-Israel, anti-Zionist voices. Very much in the way that their 1960s predecessors, again, forced Hillels to make these kinds of choices, forced the reform and conservative movements to make these kinds of choices. There are other groups like American Jews for a Just Peace. They're very small. International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. They're way out there. They're sort of the hardcore communists. And then there's an organization that we're all familiar with called J Street. And the main thing to understand about J Street is 2 things. One is that they are formally opposed to BDS at the national level. But at the local level, individual campus groups do host BDS events as part of this idea of openness, this peculiar kind of Jewish mentality of openness and balance, which is a trap. It's a trap for student organizations. It's a trap for Jewish studies programs. You either agree to host anti-Zionist groups and debate them, because you, as a professor of Yiddish, are so well versed in politics that you can hold your own against a professional organizer, or you refuse, and that's a win for them also. So you lose either way. In any case, that was a digression. J Street. The other important thing to understand about J Street is how it came into being. J Street is a tool of the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party. It was created precisely by individuals connected to the John Podesta wing of the Democratic Party, with, as it turns out, unacknowledged money at the beginning from George Soros and his family, as a wedge, as a means to split the American Jewish community away from what the progressive wing of the Democratic Party believes is slavish adherence towards AIPAC. Now, I don't hold any brief for any of these organizations, but it's been a very deliberate and very successful strategy. And it was created at the same time, and again, by the same people who created the Center for American Progress, Media Matters, also the National Iranian American Committee, NIAC, and so on. It is a political tool, and this is something that they've never really copped to, which is unfortunate. We can talk about the Christian far left, and that is, let's acknowledge that the Protestant church, particularly in this country and in Great Britain, has long had antipathy towards Israel and towards Jews on a theological basis. Again, the Jewish covenant with God has been superseded, and the Christians are up now. This has been clear in their policies since the 1930s, when they opposed Zionism, the 1940s, when most of them opposed Zionism, and most of them worked against things like refugee relief for European Jews. And it has intensified since 1967 in particular. Boycott and divestment resolutions are regularly introduced in the Presbyterian Church, Presbyterian Church USA, in the Methodist Church. BDS is strongly supported by the World Council of Churches. There are a million different European organizations, church organizations, which are NGOs supported by European governments directly. So there is a European implication in this. And by Palestinians themselves. The most important institution is the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center, founded in 1990. And you can tell from the title what the orientation is. Liberation theology, the idea that Scripture promotes the idea of liberation against oppression and occupation. And there have been a number of theological documents that they have promulgated, a kind of Palestinianized liberation theology where Palestinians take the place of the Jews as the chosen people, and the Jews shift over, the Israelis shift over to the job of the Romans. All of this to challenge Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is a very big topic. We can pick that up next time. It is not nearly as widespread within the Protestant community, certainly not the global Protestant community, as many people think. But this new liberation theology has been developed in the last 3 decades, precisely as an alternative, building on traditional Protestant concepts of supersession. Let me talk finally about another leg, and that's West Bank Palestinians. As I said, some of these organizations have surprisingly little support. Nobody seems to know who they are. At the same time, there are a number of NGOs which have a critical role in pushing BDS in a variety of different ways. Lawsuits against Israel in Israeli courts, lawsuits in international settings, outreach to all sorts of European communities in particular. Adala, Badil, Al-Haq, Al-Mizan, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Gisha, Zochrot, which is kind of Israeli-Palestinian organization. The idea is lawfare, using legal means to attack Israel in every conceivable forum. Something as simple as writing a law review article saying that Israel has no legitimacy in this or that or another context or overall, or bringing court cases here and there and anywhere. All of these are European funded. They're all funded by European NGOs and European governments, and they're a very important part of the structure of the modern BDS movement, because they are the real authentic, so to speak, face of Palestinian support for BDS. What they represent, however, is a very small slice of European-supported, educated elites. The PLO itself is opposed, well, the Fatah movement itself is opposed to Israel boycotts. And this has led Palestinian NGOs and Palestinian individuals outside of the West Bank to attack the Fatah movement as having betrayed the revolution, as having been normalizing relationships with Israel. This concept of normalization, anti-normalization, this rhetoric, is very interesting. It's very important because it is something that is now very current in the United States. It's being pushed by SJPs. It's being pushed by other organizations. Where does it come from? It comes from the 1970s, where Islamist organizations said that it is theologically unacceptable to normalize relations with Israel, and by that they meant have any kind of contact, any kind of dialogue, any kind of interaction. Then it spread to Jordan in the 1990s, and where trade unions and labor unions promoted this anti-normalization idea, both as a way to be in opposition to the Jordanian government and also to express antipathy towards Israel. And now it has spread to the United States, and it's particularly noticeable in SJP and other Muslim Brotherhood rhetoric. So let me conclude with an attempt at an explanation. Everybody who's been exposed to the modern BDS movement, I think, can't fail to be impressed by the single-mindedness, by the vehemence, by the sheer antipathy expressed in protests, in rhetoric, in print, in person. It is quite profound, really. And you can almost sort of understand that on the part of let's say, certain ethnic communities, Muslims and Palestinians. But it doesn't explain why there is so much support from the far left, and why there is so much antipathy and so much vehemence. What's the appeal? Part of it, I think, is very simple. It's a simplistic form of what we call virtue signaling. It's a way, if you're opposed to Israel in contemporary left liberal society, in intellectual circles or certain kinds of professional circles, you demonstrate your virtue by saying and doing in this way. But it goes deeper than that. At another level, I think all of this is simply another manifestation of the Jewish question. The Jewish question as articulated by Karl Marx 150 years ago in his pamphlet, The Jewish Question. What are Jews for? What are Jews supposed to do? Why do Jews still exist? What should Jews do with themselves in order to progress to the next level? And this is an issue. This is a contradiction, in particular for the left, because the survival of Jews and the existence of a Jewish state these are improbable things, to be sure. They weren't supposed to happen. Jews were supposed to give up their ethnic particularism and become, if anything, the vanguard of revolutionary progress. Well, they didn't. Some did. Lots of them did, actually, but not enough of them. And the continued existence of this ethnic group, this religious group, is a stone in the shoes of at least diehard communists, of whom there are not a few. It's a growth business these days, I would say. But I'll end with one other comment that I hope is an insight. Maybe it is and maybe it isn't. I think that the BDS movement, in particular, and much of far left politics, progressive politics in this country and globally today, really needs to be understood in a completely different way. It needs to be understood as a secular religion. It needs to be understood as politics that have been sacralized. So I'll read to you a description of what this is from an Italian political theorist, Emilio Gentile, talking about the sacralization of politics. This process takes place when, more or less elaborately and dogmatically, a political movement confers a sacred status on an earthly entity: the nation, the country, the state, humanity, society, race, the proletariat, history, liberty, revolution, and renders it an absolute principle of collective existence, considers it the main source of values for individual and mass behavior, and exalts it as the supreme ethical precept of public life. It thus becomes an object for veneration and dedication, even to the point of self-sacrifice. It is the religious dimension in politics that is distinct from and autonomous of traditional religious institutions. It has a political liturgy. It has a concept of a code of ethical and social commandments. It has a sacral history around institutional cult and figures. And this, I think, is precisely what has happened today, that the BDS movement is at the heart of a sacralization of politics. And it's part of a larger phenomenon in the West, where traditional religious organizations, religious concepts have very much broken down. And it's not surprising that this is seen most strongly in liberal Protestant denominations who have basically very little use for Jesus and for traditional visions of Christianity. It's not surprising that it is so strongly attractive to communists and socialists. And something I didn't mention, but I should have, it's so strongly attractive, increasingly, literally within the last year, to the Occupy movement and the Black Lives Movement. Now, there's been a deliberate outreach on the part of BDS groups towards these far left movements, but the attraction is there, and it is a kind of totalitarian politics on earth. And the problem is, and it uses coercion, demagoguery, totalitarian pedagogy, discrimination against the outsider. And it creates a kind of civil or political religion of its own. And this is the great danger, because it is absolutist. We're no longer talking about negotiations. We're talking about anti-normalization. We're no longer talking about coexistence. We're talking about the opposite. And some of these cues are received from Palestinian leadership, who say one thing in Arabic about the occupation beginning in 1948, and another thing in English about the occupation beginning in 1967. But you know, that 1948 occupation rhetoric, that's in English too now, and that's been very much attractive. Jewish legitimacy, Jewish sovereignty, Jewish territorial claims, Jewish history are all very much under assault by this totalizing paradigm. You're increasingly, not totally, but increasingly, you're either with us or you're against us. You're on the side of the angels or the side of the devils. And when politics turns into this kind of, black and white Manichaean concept, then all politics everywhere are in danger. And I'm afraid that this is a harbinger of changes in politics in general in the West, where the liberal democratic ideal is under assault, where liberal democracies are shrinking their spaces for free discussion of everything. Global warming, you should go to jail, and so on. And conceptually then, I think BDS acts as a kind of canary in a coal mine, so to speak. And the fact that it is intrinsically anti-Semitic, because it deals only with Jewish sovereignty. It deals only with Jewish issues. It denies legitimacy only to Jewish aspirations, is unmistakable. But that's the Jewish question. What are Jews supposed to do? Really disappear, but if you don't do that, then you're in for trouble. So let me leave it there.